In week 1, you have a reading about the importance of history where it mentions the idea of presentism. Then you have an assignment or a short response called Why Does History Matter, where it asks you to use presentism or give a demonstration of it. So this is a rather confusing concept for students who are not historians, so I wanted to make a brief slideshow to explain it to you. Presentism is when we look at the past through today's eyes. In other words, we expect people of the past to understand the things that we understand and know what we know, and that's just not how the past was. So to avoid the use of presentism in your own work and to learn how to analyze writing for presentism in history, this is a phrase you can keep in mind. People who lived before our time did not know what we know, so did not think like we think, and did not see the world the way we do. As an illustration of how you might apply presentism to history, I'm going to talk about the Salem Witchcraft Incident very briefly. This is something that most people have heard about and maybe are confused about, so I'm going to resolve your confusion and also teach you how to avoid presentism. Life in the 17th century was a scary time to live, as were all periods before modern day. The world was largely unknown in the 17th century. The settlers and new arrivals here to North America, as well as South America and other places, looked at the native peoples as though they were bloodthirsty savages because they didn't see anything familiar in their lifestyle or their belief systems. Of course, they couldn't communicate with them either. But they looked at wilderness, whether it be a desert or a dark forest or any unexplored land, most especially in Massachusetts, where the Puritan religion dominated. People looked at those areas that hadn't been settled as wilderness, and that was where the devil lived or evil lived. There were a lot of sounds out there, a lot of things going on that they couldn't explain. So to them, that was very scary. Of course, the opposite was true of Native Americans. They understood the world very well. It wasn't scary at all. But we're looking at this from a Puritan point of view in Massachusetts. So they didn't understand the natural world. There was virtually no understanding of medical knowledge like we have today. They barely understood how the human body worked. This is where we get the idea of bleeding, which is to basically let out the evil or the imbalance of the body. You're causing it to go back into balance by removing the thing that is causing the imbalance or disease. So that was a common practice back then. They really couldn't treat any diseases. The only disease that had just been discovered how to prevent was smallpox, and that was by inoculation, which means infecting someone with some material from a scab of a smallpox victim to help that person develop immunity, although they couldn't have really described it that way. They just knew that if they infected someone else and they got well, that they would not then in the future be subject to getting smallpox. There was virtually no understanding of the human mind. They didn't even understand how the mind and the body or how the brain and the body work together. So nothing about the emotional life of a human being. And death was constantly with these people every single day. So that made them look at life very differently than we do, and more of life focused on their eternal salvation. And part of that responsibility for their eternal salvation was to make sure everybody walked the right way, followed the right path. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Massachusetts in particular was focused on salvation. Individuals were focused on their own salvation as well as the salvation of their neighbors, and ministers were responsible for the salvation of their community. The community was the church. This is colony where the church was the government, the Puritan church, and the leaders of the Puritan church were the politicians of their day. So there's no separation of church and state at this time. Um, this means that religious leaders were looked at as infallible, they were always correct. Um, and outside of the religious community, the devil ruled. So this makes the world a very constant struggle between good and evil. The individual is constantly being tempted by evil, and they're constantly watching their neighbors, whether their neighbors are being tempted and succumbing to evil. It's an extremely judgmental society. Um, and that totally plays into the Salem witchcraft incident. So to understand the Salem witchcraft incident, we have to understand the world that these people lived in, and that they didn't have any explanation for events that happened in their life. Whether it was the death of a child, a financial misfortune, Native Americans attacked a village that had been built on what the English thought was their property and Native Americans thought was their property or their homeland. Um, Illnesses couldn't be explained. There was no understanding of germs. It's going to be the 20th century before we can even understand the difference between virus and bacteria. So even just a crop failure, they had to find some reason for that because they're constantly looking for evil in themselves and each other. So when something like a crop failure happens or a child dies, they try and find a reason for that, and oftentimes those reasons become someone who has been ostracized by the community for whatever reason. These oftentimes were elderly women who were widows. Having no man to take care of you or to be in charge of you, remember women had no legal rights, made a woman without a man an anathema in this society. So elderly women who were widows were looked at very suspiciously, even without any witchcraft charges. That's going to be how this plays into the Salem witchcraft trials. So to explain the Salem witchcraft incident, we can't use our modern knowledge and apply it to that situation. We have to look at it from the point of view of the people who lived at that time. To them, it made perfect sense that a witch would curse someone, or would curse a family, or would curse a farm, or a crop, or an animal, or anything. To go back and look at them and say, what were they thinking? How could they believe this? Why weren't they applying common sense to this situation? Where is their logic? Why didn't someone stop this before 19 women were hung and one man was crushed to death? This is horrific. Religious people don't do things like this. Now, if you think of the situation that way, you are applying presentism to the past. This is something to avoid because it causes us to judge the past by values and information that they did not live with. So we want to be very careful about that, and you're going to learn to use presentism in your analysis of sources in the course. So in applying presentism to historical analysis, you're going to have the opportunity of reading quite a few secondary sources. You're going to choose them, so as many as you need to use for the topic that you choose, but the course is going to focus on the development and use and the after effects of the first nuclear weapons, which were dropped on Japan by the United States in 1945. So that is the subject of your study. And all the sources you need are provided in the research kit. No outside research is allowed. What you're going to be doing with presentism is watching the authors that you read and determining if they have applied presentism in their study of the 1945 event. That's going to help you understand their point of view, perhaps lead you to identify a bias that they may have. So it's going to be very important to understand this term. And the best thing about presentism and watching for presentism in yourself is that it teaches you to think about your own thinking. That is called critical thinking, and it's one of the skills that you develop in college. I hope that this has helped you understand this kind of confusing or obscure term called presentism that's used by historians. If you have any questions about this, just let me know.